Hello everyone, and welcome to another Destiny 2 video. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Equilibrium dungeon. This dungeon has been out for a little over a week now, at the time that I'm recording this. I participated in the contest mode, although I didn't fully clear it. I've done a few normal runs, I've done some of the quest content as well, and I just want to kind of share my first impressions on this dungeon. The first encounter was surprisingly easy. The mechanics here were very straightforward, and there's pretty much only two mechanics that you need to figure out, one of which we actually figured out on our first attempt of the encounter. So we ended up clearing this in like 40 minutes, which is definitely the fastest that I've ever done anything on contest mode. I think one of the reasons why this encounter ended up being so easy was because it's just not that dangerous. Like, it's an ad clear encounter, so you can just build fully into ad clear and survivability. You do have to damage the orange and yellow bar behemoths as they spawn in, right? You have to kill those in a limited amount of time, on contest at least. But you can just use the speeder bikes for damage, and that's what I was doing during contest mode. And I was dealing like a decent amount of damage, enough damage to clear the encounter within the time constraints. I'm not going to say that this encounter was too easy. You know, I didn't clear the dungeon, so I'm in no position to say anything like that. But you know, having done contest mode, I had fun clearing this encounter on contest, but after having done it a few times on normal, I will say that it starts to get a little dull. If it was made to be a little bit more dangerous, it would be probably more interesting on both contest and normal difficulties. And you know, with the speeder bites, they're kind of giving you all the damage that you need to clear the encounter, so you're going to be using survivability focused builds anyway. So yeah, I think they could have afforded to make it a little bit more dangerous. That's like the only specific critique that I can think of for this encounter. This encounter takes place on Venus, and the rest of the dungeon takes place in space pretty much, on a Cabal ship, I believe, or space station or something like that. And so you actually hop on a ship to transition from the first encounter to the rest of the dungeon, which I thought was pretty cool. The second encounter is probably my favorite encounter out of the three. Mechanically, this encounter is just as straightforward as the first, I would say. And this is another encounter that I would say is not particularly dangerous. The ads here really didn't feel threatening at all. And survivability during the DPS phase was also really a non-issue. But yeah, for whatever reason, I enjoy this encounter more than the other two. I feel like there's just a little bit of a better flow to it. I have one critique for this encounter, and that is the fact that the fuses, right? There's like these 4 fuses that fill up with arc energy. When he does an attack and breaks one of these fuses, it damages his shield. So when we first saw that happen, my team and I, naturally, we assumed, oh, we've got to have him break one of those fuses to get enough damage to start the DPS phase. So what we ended up doing was, in order to break his shield, we would put him in the pit twice, right, which does like 30% shield damage each time. And then in order to start the DPS phase, we would just stand near one of the fuses and have him hit it, which would get rid of the remainder of his shield. We did not know that you could just have him jump in the pit, and then after he comes out of the pit, you use the taken grenade to deal additional damage to his shield. And that's how you start the DPS phase. So, you know, we probably should have been scouting around a little bit more, maybe, seeing what other people were doing, but I do think that it's kind of misleading that the fuses actually deal damage to his shield, because really they're supposed to be used as a DPS extension, right? You walk over to them mid-phase and have him hit them, and it extends the DPS phase. I don't know why the fuses have to deal damage to his shield, which seems a little unnecessary. But we did end up clearing it. We took longer than we should have to clear this encounter, but we did end up doing it, even though we were kind of brute forcing it a little bit and we weren't fully understanding the mechanics. Overall, though, like I said, this is my favorite encounter in the dungeon. The boss is kind of just like a reskinned Gowron with, lightsabers and a unique attack. But I don't know, it didn't feel stale, right? It felt like a unique enemy, the way he kind of teleports around the map and goes invisible and all that. It didn't feel like I was fighting a boss that I had fought before. During contest, my team and I were unable to clear the third and final encounter. It wasn't for a lack of trying. We spent like a whole day just on this one encounter. And we could have spent more time, but we couldn't make it work out. It was basically just damage that we were struggling with. We tried a handful of different strats, just couldn't make anything work out, right? I think maybe if I had been more flexible, if I had been able to be proficient with another character, have builds available for another character, maybe I could have made the difference. But I have not been playing Destiny super consistently during the back half of this year, right? I haven't had the motivation to. And so I was only really comfortable playing Hunter during this contest mode. The lowest we got the boss was probably like 35 to 40% health. We just couldn't be consistent enough with our damage. Now, this encounter, to me, it didn't feel super dangerous, but I think it's easily the most dangerous encounter in this dungeon. Take the stuff that I say about survivability with a grain of salt, because we settled on using sword damage for this boss because we just found it to be the most consistent, and it didn't work out in the end, but whatever. But because we were on sword DPS, I was running Fortune's Favor, which just gives me an overshield all the time, and I was able to like just survive things that would kill anyone who was like not using Fortune's Favor, right? I was able to play kind of recklessly and still survive due to that overshield. Even if I wasn't using Fortune's Favor, there were a few times where we were trying other strats and I was using like Hoyle Sword Arachne, for example, and I would still have like nutty survivability there. But with me using Hoyle Sword Arachne for survivability, my damage sucked, so we ended up just using swords. Anyway, this encounter is probably mechanically the most complex. This is easily the most mechanically complex encounter in the dungeon, although it is, on the surface, it seems more complex than it really is. Getting to damage is actually like very straightforward, but there's like, I think there's probably a lot of nuance in the way that you play this encounter. There's a lot of like areas in which you can do things more efficiently. And I've having only done this encounter a few times on normal mode, I'm still clueless as far as the most efficient way to go about the mechanic phases. One thing that I have noticed that is kind of not my favorite is it's possible to get in this situation where, like, if everyone on your team ends up mismanaging their buff, which is pretty easy to do. Let's say everyone compels their shade, and then you go back to outside the Ascendant Plane, and then maybe there are things that need to be done outside the Ascendant Plane, such as taking down the shields of the red guys, as my team calls them, or closing conduits. But everyone compelled, and so, or maybe, someone compelled and someone else died, and basically no one has a buff, so you have to build a buff outside, and that's like a kind of a slow process, and it feels like kind of a break in the momentum of the encounter if you end up having to build a buff in the overworld, if you will. So yeah, that's just like my number one critique, right? Just my first impression. It could be a skill issue, I don't know, but that happened a lot to my team during contest mode, where it kind of felt like we were just sitting around and waiting for the encounter to cycle, because it felt like the progress that we were able to make was somewhat limited until we got back to the Ascendant Plane. Another thing that I'm not crazy about is the way that the extensions worked in these encounters, right? So there's a timer that flips you between the overworld and the Ascendant Plane. And I believe you can't actually extend if you're within, like if your timer is under a certain number. I believe the extensions just don't trigger. I'm not 100% sure why this is. So I think this is another thing that kind of contributes to the awkwardness of the encounter sometimes, because, you know, you get past a certain point, and even if you have an extension available, there's no point in using it, right? Because you're past the point to where the extension would actually take effect. So you can't make any like clutch plays in that regard. But it's not all bad. I think the boss for this encounter is pretty unique. He's got a couple of unique attacks, and I feel like this encounter can kind of actually fall into an interesting rhythm, right? When everything goes kind of according to plan, and when you don't have those situations where you're sitting around trying to build a buff, I feel like this encounter can have a pretty good flow to it, where you're kind of juggling mechanics, right? You're managing a buff, you are taking out the hands, you're dealing with conduits, you're triggering the extensions, right? You're killing ads. You're juggling all of these aspects of the encounter. And that's the thing that makes it mechanically the most challenging encounter in the dungeon. And I think when you're doing all of those things successfully, it's very engaging and interesting. But when you kind of break that rhythm, and when you have to recover and rebuild a buff, like when you don't have a buff that you need, that's when the encounter kind of loses steam and it just feels awkward. Feels like you're just waiting. And I don't like that. But yeah, overall, I wouldn't say this is a bad encounter. And I'm not disappointed in my contest mode performance. I would have obviously liked to have cleared this on contest mode, but I mean, I understand why I didn't. You know, the fact of the matter is I wasn't up to date on the meta. I wasn't very flexible. And therefore, even though I felt that I was playing pretty well, I just couldn't get past the DPS check. But I had a good time. The contest experience for this dungeon was fun. Oh, post clear stuff, right? You have a quest. I've dabbled in the quest content. I'm about halfway through the quest right now, but I tagged along running the quest with some other people that were further ahead than I was, so I've kind of seen it all. I'm going to give the dungeon points here because I think the quest content is all pretty solid, and it's not time gated. So yeah, it gets points in that department. So that's all I've got for my first impressions of the Equilibrium dungeon. Overall, I think it's just kind of an average dungeon. There's a few things that I thought were cool. There's a few things that I wasn't a huge fan of. It's just kind of, I think, middle of the road. You know, it's not, I don't think it's spectacular. I don't think it's lame. I think it's just middle of the road dungeon. It's satisfactory. If you're a Star Wars fan, maybe this is your favorite dungeon because it's Star Wars themed, right? But I'm kind of neutral on all that. My opinions on this dungeon may very well change as I attempt to, do my solo flawless clear and all that, or maybe as I try to do the feats. I think feats are a stupid system, just to keep it a buck. Not a fan of feats at all. Not in any rush to do the feats on this dungeon. I would much rather just have like a normal version and a master version. But yeah, let me know how your contest clear went in the comments. I'd be interested to hear other people's experiences in that regard. I'm sure some people were able to clear this dungeon very quickly, right? Because I'm not a particularly good player, and I was able to get 2 out of the 3 encounters, and I was almost able to clear the final one if we had just been able to get a little bit more consistent damage. But yeah, that's all I've got for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.